Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs podcast. Before I jump into today's episode, which is part 2 of my interview with Chris Firestone about religion and science and the Church Fathers, I wanted to make you aware that this Friday we are beginning recording production on the East-West series. So those of you who follow this content regularly, you're familiar with a trailer that we've been offering here regularly, every single episode, about the East-West series. And this series is a multi-part lecture series that is aimed at illuminating the differences between the Christian East and the Christian West. And that series has been available for pre-sale for some months now as part of our fundraising efforts. And as I've mentioned within that advertisement, the current pricing is the cheapest that series will ever be offered. And I want to make you aware, if you've been thinking about, I think I would like to support that series, or I'd like to buy that series, or whatever it might be, that offer is going to expire on October 15th. So if you're considering jumping on board and buying the series in advance, or want to support at a higher tier, where you actually can purchase not only the series and other assets, but also one-on-one meetings with me, well, that window will close come October 15th. So if that is of interest to you, go over to the eastwestseries.com. That's the eastwestseries.com. And look at the various support tiers and decide which one is right for you. I really do need your support to make this series possible, and thank you. Sincerely, thank you to everyone who has decided to support this series, because it really wouldn't be possible without you folks. So I am greatly appreciative, and am very excited to bring this content to you. So be watching for release details. We will be releasing the initial episodes at the end of October, and more details to come. There are some exciting partnerships to be announced related to that. So as I said, details to come. But that also provides context for one other announcement that I have, which is that I am going to be taking a couple of weeks off from the podcast in order to move into production on the East-West series. So you're about to be thrust into a black hole, void of my podcast. And I am sincerely sorry for that. I hope none of you despair. I'd always encourage you, if you haven't consumed everything on this channel, then go back and here's your chance to catch up. But we will be back in a few weeks. But in the meantime, I just want to, again, encourage you to go over to the eastwestseries.com and purchase that series in advance, get behind it, support the series, and I look forward to sharing more with you as we approach the release date at the close of October. Now, as for today's episode, which is our last episode before the break, you'll recall that last week on Tuesday, I released part 1 of an interview with Chris Firestone, where we talked about creation and evolution and the Eastern Church Fathers. And you can go ahead and watch that episode in order to catch up. And today we are looking at part 2 of my conversation with Chris Firestone. So that's coming at you today. But before we jump in there, here's a trailer for the East-West series.
The Christian East and the Christian West share the same creed, the same scriptures, and yet they are worlds apart. The differences run deeper than Mary or icons or liturgy, going to the very nature of God, the hope of salvation, and even what it means to be human. They use the same words, but their meanings could not be more different. As these two worlds collide in our contemporary culture, what's needed is a translator. I spent nearly 2 decades studying these two traditions, devoting myself to figures like Augustine, Aquinas, and the Reformers in the West, but finding myself crossing the threshold of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And now, I'm producing a 25-part lecture series to help bridge this gap, exploring the differences between Eastern and Western Christianity. Pre-order the series now at the lowest price that will ever be offered, or support my efforts by becoming a series producer at theeastwestseries.com. That's theeastwestseries.com.
I was just trying to think through the implications, mental gymnastics, the implications of this. So you could be a young earther from a theological standpoint, That is, from God's perspective, it's just 6 days.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to press the solar days into how we must think about the historic past,
Right.
then you're going to have some tensions here.
Yeah. Well, and this goes into a nuanced area of patristic theology, Eastern patristic theology, Orthodox theology, that I don't know if it's quite as well known. So a lot of people, I think, within the West, and obviously we'll get back to your question about my stance on evolution, but a lot of people in the West, I think, have a sort of simplistic view of time and eternity that they really inherited largely from, Thomas Aquinas almost, but medieval scholasticism, which is that like God is eternal and we're temporal. And what that means is we experience this unfolding moment-to-moment sort of thing. But if you step outside of time, you're now in this static now, which is God's stuff.
Right.
And that's where God is. And so he sees all the things at once. And, and that's it, right? Time, eternity, that sort of thing. And within the Eastern Fathers, you actually see a much more nuanced view of these things. So first of all, they do say explicitly that time is a creature. And that's an interesting fact in itself because, as Aristotle points out, Plato alone thought there was a start to time amongst the pagans, right? So it's a very unique position that they actually think time begins and is created. Like, that's wild that they even take that position. But then with that, they also have this concept of eternity.
Right.
But eternity is not what I described. First of all, it's not static. And second of all, it's not native to God, not in the way I described.
Yes.
And so their concept of eternity, first of all, is that it moves. It just moves differently than time.
Yes.
And why? It's because it's the movement of spirits. So C.S. Lewis had said this in his opening of Paralandra in the Space Trilogy, where he talks about one of these guys, Ransom, encounters this Eldil, right? This, what is an angel? And he has this moment of realizing that as he's sitting here and he's waiting in the space between the conversation, his heart is beating, his blood is flowing. He realizes this thing is a non-biological thing for whom they don't have that biological ticking clock.
Yes.
And their experience of reality must be totally different, right? He has that realization, in the way that only Lewis would weave into a narrative like that, right? But that's important because one of the things you see is, first of all, there's this phrase that shows up often in Eastern texts. It shows up in the New Testament, Revelation too, but unto ages of ages. And that word age is the word for eternity. So this is like the eternities of the eternity. Right. And so John of Damascus draws an analogy where he says, as days are to time, so ages are to eternity. And the reason is because eternity does move. It has sequences. It just moves differently than time. So the angels are said to be eternal by Pseudo-Dionysius. Well, he doesn't mean they weren't created. He just means that they're pure spirits. And so the way they experience reality is spiritual in nature. And we are meant to move from being an organic, being to one that becomes spiritual. And so we transition to eternity. So in Genesis or in Revelation, time stops, but stuff keeps happening, right? There comes an end to time, but things keep on unfolding.
Yes.
Right. And so that's one of the things that you find in these Eastern Fathers. Well, and then what's interesting is for them, eternity is itself a divine energy, right? And so these divine energies it's a whole nother topic. I've got an entire episode on that people could listen to. But there's a distinction between God's essence and his energies, meaning you might think of it as the difference between the nature of mind itself and the activity or operation of articulating things like I'm doing right now.
Right.
So you're hearing the operative powers of mind at work.
Right.
Right. And there's a distinction, like that's an extension of it in some ways, but it's the articulation of that nature. And so the Eastern Fathers, drawing on this entire chain from Aristotle through, the Alexandrian Judaism into the New Testament, make this sort of distinction where there is a distinction between what God is in himself, his nature, which is beyond our grasp, and the operative powers that exude or proceed from him that are what we encounter and by which we come to know him. And eternity is one of those. right? So so the angels are actually participating in a divine energy, something that's a divine expression, an expression of God's spiritual nature.
Yes.
And yet, then you find in certain liturgical texts, like hymnody, for example, you find references to God as the pre-eternal God. And so what on earth would that mean? Well, so what that means is that the Holy Trinity is not natively eternal in the sense of standing outside in a static now or something like that. First of all, that's not what eternity is. And second of all, eternity is an expression of God. What God is in and of himself transcends even that. And so you have this specific God time, right?
Yes.
Pre-eternal. Now, the reason that's, of course, all important is because it does seem a precarious thing. That if you're saying how God expresses himself is in the sequences and modes of eternal activity. But we're going to measure that, presuming there's a one-for-one correlation with the creature called time. Well, that seems rather problematic. It seems overly simplistic. It, in fact, seems to make God purely temporal in a way that he clearly is not.
Yes.
So,
well, man, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. Let me throw this out because I think some of the audience might have a similar question for you. One of the things I heard early on in our conversation was that it would be an act of deception. Hypothetically, if God were to create the world 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age.
Right. I'm open to that critique.
That
possibility.
What if somebody, someone with a more literalist understanding of Scripture said the same thing applies to the Bible? Why would he write this with the appearance of it being young?
I think that's a great question.
And so why? Tell me, Dr. Jacobs, why aren't you being duplicitous on this thing?
No. So this is a great question, and this is where I think the Alexandrian hermeneutics are so important. Because if the Alexandrian hermeneutic was, I know the Bible looks like it's saying this, but we're just telling you it's not, then you would have a real problem. But the entire Alexandrian hermeneutic is that the text itself is it's bidding the reader to be careful.
Yes.
Because it's deep and rich.
Yes.
Because it's written by God. Right. Yeah. And for that reason, it wants you to attend and ask hard questions of it. And it'll answer those questions if you press it on those, but it wants you to press it on those.
Yes.
Right. And so, like I said, with the way Gregory of Nyssa and St. Macrina read, the talk of Hades in Christ's parable, everything about how they build that case is based on the text itself. The text itself is providing the breadcrumbs that force you to think beyond the literalist reading of it.
Yes.
And as we pointed out, there's a bunch of things in Genesis that should force you in that direction.
Yes.
First of all, the primary point of view, the character you're following, who's active, everybody else in the narrative is passive, is God.
Yeah.
So if we're going to say that for God a day is 1,000 years and 1,000 years is a day, which is to say that time functions differently for him. Like he is not a temporal being, right? He's the Ancient of Days, right? Yeah. Well, then maybe this talk of days isn't so literal. That if the sun doesn't show up until day 4 and that's there for marking times and seasons in the way that we do, maybe the marking of times and seasons before it shows up isn't solar.
Right.
Right? That's a clue. The days have a beginning and the end. It goes out of its way to add that and then omits it with day 7.
Yeah.
That's another clue, right?
Right.
There's this peculiar warning. The day you eat of it, you're going to die. Then you don't die.
Yes.
That's another clue, right? And so it's not a duplicity. This is where I think it's fair to raise the objection and say, look, if you think God can't be a deceiver, this text seems to be deceptive. I would say, well, it seems deceptive to the superficial reader,
right?
To the non-careful reader. But that's true of the Bible as a whole.
Yeah, that's true.
Everything about the Bible.
It's the whole problem with proof texting.
An extraordinarily careful reading.
Yes.
Because the text is more deep and more rich and more layered than any other text you will ever encounter. And so I don't think that's deception. Now, you could come back and say, Well, I think the same thing is true of natural revelation, the book of revelation that is the cosmos. Maybe. Now, this is where I'm going to admit I am not a scientist, right? And so I have a bunch of hearsay about problems with evolution. I have a bunch of hearsay about evidence for evolution.
Yes.
But it's nothing more than hearsay.
Right.
It's not my discipline. And so is it true that there's a bunch of clues in nature that say, well, is that evidence as strong as it seems for the 13.8 or for this or for that?
Right.
I don't know. It's not my discipline. Am I open to the possibility that that's true? That God, just like with Scripture, is saying, here's the book of nature, but I'm going to provide a bunch of clues. I'm open to that possibility. Now, my suspicion is that the clues are not clues that the world is only 6,500 years old. My suspicion is the clues are, this can't be happenstance.
Right.
Right? Like that's the clues that are there. That's my suspicion, but it's just a suspicion because I'm not a scientist.
Yes. No, that's fascinating. I think in a certain sense it's liberating as well. I mean, we know enough about the history of science to know that it hasn't always been pure.
No. I mean, 100%. And this is where, like, I don't want to let the young Earth creationists be the only one who are subject to critique here.
Right.
Right. Like, there is a myth that says that science is philosophically and theologically neutral. We're just dealing with the facts. That is nonsense. And it is nonsense historically speaking. So like one of the first of all, the entire mechanical philosophy, which is the crude form of the empirical sciences that gave rise to the empirical sciences as we know them.
Yes.
That was explicitly a speculative anti-Aristotelian movement. There was a bunch of empiricists who had a distaste for the Aristotelian metaphysics. They didn't like talking about abstract forms and things like that. They wanted stuff that you can grab and touch and taste, this empiricist impulse. And so the original mechanical philosophy was nothing but bald speculation, right? People like Pierre Gassendi sitting there and saying, well, maybe atoms coalesce in this way. Some are squishy and some are ribbed, and that's why these stick together hard. And it wasn't based on any empirical science. It was just speculation. And even when people like Francis Bacon were like, no, we've got to figure out a scientific method. We've got to push for this, right? It was still a tall order that people didn't think they could do. And when you look at certain people like Robert Boyle, he became a rock star in this area, specifically because he seemed to finally do it. If you look at his experiment, it's total nonsense, right? First of all, it's metaphysical in nature. It is about metaphysics. It's not philosophically neutral, and it's false. But, it's basically that they had figured out how to create a vacuum. And so within Aristotelian thinking, light is a form, and there must be subtle matter between us because that form is present between us. Right. They believed in a plenum, the idea that there is no such thing as true empty space, like void of nothing, like a complete void. But the mechanical philosophy being ancient atomists who believed in a void in atoms as the composition of all things, they had to believe in a void. And so Robert Boyle went ahead and he's like, we can finally create a vacuum. If I can create a vacuum and shine light into it, I can demonstrate that light is not actually a abstract form that's carried in a plenum. He can disprove the plenum theory. And that was considered mind-blowing to people. Now, obviously, it's ridiculous, like the idea that there's no material involved in the light being shown within there, right? Like, it's not a true vacuum in the sense of a void, right? The way we would think of a void. But my point in that is not to debunk Boyle's experiment. My point in that is to say that Boyle was clearly, the empirical sciences at their origin were clearly philosophically motivated, clearly philosophically committed, and clearly aimed at, in their experiments, making metaphysical points.
Yes.
And so, first of all, I would just say that I don't think the sciences are immune to this. I think scientists will oftentimes prove to any observant philosopher that they think they're dealing in raw facts, but they're wading into philosophy.
Yes.
And they're doing it poorly because they're not self-aware that they're doing it and they're not trained in philosophy. And so this is one of the areas where I'm all for philosophical criticisms and reinterpretations of philosophy. I'd point people to Edward Feser here, spelled like Fesser, F-E-S-E-R. He's a Thomist, right? He's a Roman Catholic. And so as a Thomist, he has a very sort of classical metaphysic, Aristotelian metaphysic, one that I'm sympathetic to in many ways. And he's done a lot of work, like on Aristotle's Revenge, I think is what the book is, where he's just pointing out the ways in which some of the sciences are starting to move back to Aristotle's hot again, right? Because the view of matter that's starting to emerge in the sciences has greater resonance with Aristotle's older view of matter and things like that. And he provides an apparatus for accepting the conclusions of science, the findings of science, but reinterpreting those through a different metaphysic. And showing that, the underlying tacit metaphysic, the unstated metaphysic, isn't the only possible way of reading this data. And I think that's really valuable. So I would definitely critique the empirical sciences, and then I'd throw in one further critique. And I think this is extremely valid. I think there's a lot of us, and I say us, and me as an outsider, an armchair scientist who's not a scientist, right? I get the impression there are serious problems for the theory of evolution, scientifically speaking. All right. And so I think the theory there probably should be a critical mass of information at this point that makes people say, I'm not sure this is right. But why won't science do that? Well, because it has an allergy to the God of the gaps. And if all of a sudden we say all this stuff, we don't have a mechanism for how it comes about.
Once you let the religious, camel's nose in the tent,
right?
We'll never get it out again.
Yeah. So if you suddenly are committed to the idea that, the division of species is not something that emerges one species from another in the way that we've explained it, and we have a Cambrian explosion where they're just all sort of there, and that the differences across species seem to be accidental, not essential traits that would ever blur the lines between species. You open that door, now we've got a massive gap in our explanation. And that gap is one where a lot of people are just going to say, God, we don't want that. And so it's better to have a bad theory that's stumbling along than to have no theory.
Yes.
And I'm inclined to think that suspicion is correct. And that's a fair criticism to say, like, look, is this just confirmation bias, right? We need a purely naturalistic mechanism.
Yes.
Because we're scientists, right? Yeah. Who are methodologically naturalists.
Yes.
And therefore, that's going to blind us to certain evidences contrary to the things that we're currently saying. I think that's a completely fair criticism.
Well, if I'm hearing you, accurately here, we have similar issues residing on both ends of the spectrum. We have the Copernicus and the Galileo incident, which seem to expose it in the West anyway, a dogmatic bias, as it were, that was unable to entertain scientific truths. On this other end, with Expel and other things that are happening in contemporary science, where you're like, hold on a second, you're actually being religious in how you approach scientific truth at this point, knowing full well that there's weaknesses here. Mm-hmm. And those weaknesses are adding up to such a degree that they should tip the scales. But if you open that door, you can't let the God of the gaps back in. But if I'm hearing you correctly, we as truth seekers, and people who hold to a strong view of biblical authority, that's precisely where we need to live, is in that in-between area when we're talking about science, when we're talking about the age of the earth and other things. Is that fair?
I think it is fair, right? So I think it is a risky proposition to hand over everything to the sciences, right? Mainly because science is always changing. Right. And so to wed your theology to the sciences such that if the science falls, your theology falls, I think is really problematic.
Right.
I think it's a dangerous proposition because it misunderstands science and where it's at and what it offers. So I think there's that. But I think it's an equally dangerous proposition to stuff your fingers in your ears and close your eyes and start humming because you don't want to hear what the scientists are discovered.
Right.
And I think that middle ground is to be able to engage in them in an open-minded, philosophical way and theological way, that understands that, well, this is what it is, right? This is just this is data that's emerging that needs to be interpreted. And there might be a certain interpretation of it that you disagree with. But to simply ignore it,
right,
and just say it's all a grand conspiracy I think that's dangerous.
Is that a product of your realism, your commitment to realism, the sense that all truth is God's truth, and the world is far more intriguing, complex, and meaningful than we ever imagined it to be? A product of an infinite, all-powerful God who sees time very differently than we do. And so that seems to me to be a healthy theological corrective to the current way in which we think about how science is approaching these, or how Christians who are embracing science think about these things. And so I guess I'm intrigued to go back then to where you're going with evolution theory and how you're going to sort of handle that one. If I'm trying to force Jacobs into a pigeonhole, I'm going to say, well, he's going to be some kind of older, maybe DH. I don't really, because if you're not going to go with evolution, how do we get to someone like, Meyer's position of intelligent design and of other things? How do the church fathers get us to a substantive and nuanced and careful understanding of these historic matters of time and space and creation and the age of the earth and all of that?
Yeah. So let me start with, let me offer a slight prelude, just to your question about whether it's a product of my realism. Then I'll move into the church fathers and what I think opens the door for not being, opposed to these things in the way that some might be.
Right.
And then I think I'll sort of move into, I guess, the evolution question. So let's see how quickly
give us a teaser on that one for sure.
Yeah. So in terms of the preamble, I just say this: I've always been interested. It's like my entire journey, right? I explored all sorts of possibilities. And I always wanted to remain open-minded, even to things that I thought were horrifying, because I thought it was important to being an honest broker, right? The whole reason I went into Kant was because I was inclined to think metaphysics is where it's at. And you were basically like, no, I can't do metaphysics after Kant. And I was like, well, we'll see, right? And so I took very seriously that challenge. I dove into Kant. And so I think for myself, I've always, as part of my pursuit of truth, I've never been the sort who has a sort of fundamentalist commitment that these things are plainly true, all things are false, and now I have an adversarial relationship with anything that might threaten that.
Yes.
I've always had sort of an open-minded approach to it. I think with that realism, which is where I eventually came down, because I wasn't always a realist. I was a nominalist, a purist, a heretic, right? And so...
I wouldn't have put those words to it, but no, you mentioned it. No.
But I came down on realism, and I do think there's a reason why. I think when you're a realist, you naturally are inclined to think, well, the underlying mind, capital M, that gives rise to all things is rational, right? And my mind is a small image of that. That's part of what makes it possible for me to recognize these patterns within the world. And it's part of the reason we can talk intelligently about God and what God, the omnipotence and these sorts of conversations, about like qualified omnipotence and the sorts of philosophical and theological conversations you find, not just in the philosophers, but in the church fathers, who are themselves philosophers, properly defined. And so, yes, I think there's a natural inclination to think that the world is intelligible. As a realist, I'm inclined to think that the world is intelligible. I think that's discernible to us. And so the idea of saying, like, I'm gonna close my eyes and stop my ears to what the world is telling me, And I don't mean the world like in the Bible sense of like the outward powers of, that are assailing this. I just mean the map of nature would be crazy, right? I think that's lunacy. Now, I think that means how it's interpreted is always correct by the sciences? No, and we've talked about that. But am I inclined to think that the world is a very good source of information? Like, yes, I am. I am inclined to think that. So I think that's true. Now, in terms of the church fathers, let me talk a little bit about, I'll just touch on some of the things that I touched on in that video. That I've also touched on theological letters. Like I said, if you go to theologicalletters.com, you can find 2 posts on evolution where I more meticulously map out the same points I make in that video. And then I actually do address the evolution question directly. But I'll just say that, a lot of the objections, putting aside objections about like, if you think the church fathers are omniscient or you think there's a consensus there, those sorts of things that I've already talked about that I think, I'm not sympathetic to those sorts of things because, like I said, I don't see gathering a series of texts where these 5 church fathers all think the world is 6,500 years old constitutes a substantive consensus of the fathers. And obviously I've talked about that. I'm not sympathetic to the idea that I have to be a geocentrist because they are, or that I have to believe in crystalline spheres, or I have to hold that view of optics, right? And we've already talked about those sorts of things. But I think the more substantive theological points, and this goes to the thing that I'd said was problematic about carrying Protestant young earth theology into an Orthodox context, is that so much of the objection to an Orthodox or to an old earth is really sort of 2 things. One is obviously the days of Genesis, that they just on the surface of it, they seem to contradict an old earth. And then the second thing is death, right? And the fact that once you have 13.8 billion years, don't you just have to have animals dying? And don't you, if we're going to accept the paleontology, are we going to accept also that, there was disease and things like that, sickness, genetic mutations and problems in there? And that's not possible, prior to the fall of man. And so normally the death boogeyman is there quite prominently. And my point, one of the things that I made there with regard to the church fathers is they have a much more nuanced view of death. So if you track how they use the words like thanatos and phthora, right, which are the words for like death and corruption, you find multiple definitions. Right? These are versatile words. It can mean that you have an organic body that breaks apart, right? That would be a form of corruption. It can mean that a living thing, an animated body, separates soul and body. Right? So the body ceases to be animated. It can mean that. It can mean corruption, which is a distortion of nature. I gash my eye and all of a sudden I can't see. And it can also mean spiritual corruption. I'm supposed to be righteous and I become wicked by choice, right? So it can mean any number of those things. And so the first question, when you say that death enters the world, right? Or that God is not the author of death, right? Normally in Protestant circles, it's focused on St. Paul and talking about, death entering the world through sin. In Orthodox circles, because you have wisdom of Solomon, you have, God is not the author of death, right? And so these are sort of 2 different considerations. And so one of the questions, so that immediately it moves into none of that can be present. But I think that's far too superficial. I think it's far too superficial because we have to actually ask, like when Wisdom of Solomon is saying God's not the author of death, is it saying like nothing organic ever broke apart, right? Or is it saying something else, right? I'm more inclined to think, based on the theology of the church fathers and what I know about the history of ideas, that this text is more likely saying that God is not the author of corruption, because within the pagan context, distortions and corruptions were just a result of pesky matter, right? The fact that matter just can't cooperate with the forms and get us that, right? And so I'm inclined to think that the context of wisdom in Solomon is actually addressing the fact that corruption is a byproduct of the fall of man, that free creatures introduce distortions of nature,
Right.
and that God doesn't introduce distortions of nature. Okay. And that still leaves open the question of, is plants dying or animals dying a distortion of nature?
Yes.
And I'll come back to that. Right. And similarly with St. Paul, right? When you talk about like all dying in Adam or death, death entering the world through Adam, again, you have to ask in this context, is he talking about, is the all man or is it the cosmos? Right. And so I think the first thing you just have to ask, the reason I started with the question of death is to say, when the biblical text is talking about these things, is it saying there was no organic bodies that broke apart, no souls ever left bodies, no one had ever sinned, right?
Right.
And there were no like distortions of nature. Like, is it saying all of those things or is it saying some of those things?
Yes. Yeah.
Now, the reason I raise that in is because it's important to recognize that there's a fair bit of begging the question that happens here when people will immediately hear that setup. And obviously, you know what begging the question means in a logical context. I don't think most people know what it means, right? But it's when you use your conclusion as one of your premises,
Right.
right? There's no there's no death before the fall. And therefore, this death can't be present before the fall because there's no death before the fall, right? Like,
It's also, equivocation and so
right? Yeah, it becomes tautological in some ways, right? It's just, and that's the whole thing, is they can't use as the premise there's no death before the fall to address this question, because that would be a circular form of reasoning or form of begging the question, logical fallacy. And so that's why I'm raising that. And one of the things that I point out, and so I go through a series of things that indicate that that's probably it's probably not saying that none of these things were present before the fall. So I point out, for example, in Genesis, that God says you can eat any seed-bearing plants, for food. Well, when you eat an organic body, you are going to break it apart. The moment you bite into it, you are breaking it apart.
Yes.
That's the first definition of death that you find.
Yes.
Right. Another thing that is very peculiar, right, to a lot of contemporary folks, but it's relevant to this, is that the church fathers believe they have an ancient view of soul. We have a very modern view. Because of influence of people like Descartes, we have a tendency to think of soul as mind.
Yes.
Right. And so dogs don't have souls and plants don't have souls, but that's not how the ancient world thought. They thought the mind is more spirit, right? They use that term for that. Whereas soul just referred to the life force of a body. So any animated body has a soul. So yeah, animals have souls and plants have souls. And so that means that when you kill a plant, right, and you start to see it deteriorate, you've separated the life force from the body. You've separated soul from body.
Yes.
Right. And so that's the second definition of death. Now, the reason that's relevant is because if you have an Eden that I can eat of plants, and that's not a corruption, that's not a distortion of nature, everything's still ideal. Well, that means that plant death is perfectly natural.
Right.
That the first two forms of death were present in Eden.
So Adam and Eve did cut the grass.
I mean, I hate to put it that way. I mean, just the images seem laughable, but
you're right. A certain kind of death is present,
right? And I've heard some people in the comments try to get around this, but I truthfully, I think all the ways of getting around it are either misunderstand the argument or they're absurd.
Right.
And so a lot of people will just say, like, no, back then, they eating wouldn't have killed it, right, or something like this. But I'm sitting here going, okay, so what are we talking about? So Adam plucks a fruit, right? Okay, first of all, he broke the stem. So the first definition of death, of the breaking part of an organic body, is already present. But okay, let's ignore that for a minute.
It only eats the fallen food.
Okay, so it just still means that there is a natural state of breaking apart of organic bodies. But let's just ignore that part. He opens his mouth wide. He doesn't bite it. He just like swallows it whole so that he doesn't break it apart.
Yes.
Also, by the way, he's not going to absorb any of the nutrients, which would involve breaking it apart.
Right.
It's just going to pass through his digestive system and come out the other end. And then what? Go back to the tree? Like, I look at that, I'm like, I don't know.
And then I say,
I look at that, I go, that's patently absurd. Like, that's not even eating it. And in fact, from a natural law perspective, I would say to pass them through your digestive system that's not even going to provide nutrients, this is going to just come out the other end, is probably a violation of the order of nature.
it's evil.
So I look at that and I'm going like, this is an absurdity. And why would I even believe that? Question begging, right? Because I can't say that there's any breaking apart of the organic body. Other people have made appeals to saying, well, no. In Eden, the plants willfully gave up the fruit. Well, first of all, that's problematic for a couple of reasons. From an Orthodox perspective, the Church Fathers are very clear that plants only have a vegetative soul. They don't actually have an exercise of will, which is a higher order. Self-determination is something that only rational beings have, which they don't have. So, yes, you might find language that seems anthropomorphic in somebody like Chrysostom, who's saying that the world, like the earth, was more cooperative with Adam, right? But Chrysostom is plainly not saying that it has free will and it is willfully doing that. Second of all, I'm not even sure what the relevance would be. Sort of freely giving you its fruit. The problem isn't that you're taking its fruit without permission. We're just talking about whether when you take it, you break the stem.
Yes.
When you bite into it, you break apart the body. Whether in you absorbing the nutrients from it and things like that and dispelling it, whether you are separating the life of it from the body, right?
Yes.
That's what we're talking about. And so one of those things, and truthfully, you'd have to, in order to defend that, you'd have to actually appeal to Second Temple Jewish animistic practices, which aren't true in the Father. So anyway, so all that's to say is that it's like, these things, they're not relevant, right? At the end of the day, what we're simply talking about is the fact of the matter is when you break the stem, if you bite into it, if you absorb its nutrients, if you then dispel it, right? Like the first two forms of death are present at least within the realm of plants.
Yeah.
Now, I think the thing is a lot of people are sort of thrown by that because they're like, well, I don't know how to process, right? That there could be death of a certain kind that's not evil because they're so accustomed to thinking of death as this evil that's introduced. And this is where I introduced a scholastic distinction that I find really helpful. So this isn't from the Eastern Church Fathers. Conceptually, it's saying the Eastern Church Fathers, but the terms I'm going to use are from the Latin West, from the scholastics, which they draw a distinction between privation and negation, right? Privatio and negatio. Privation, as you're well familiar with from, my work when I was doing all this different Latin stuff early on. You were there when I was studying Augustine, the scholastics and all that, is that refers to a distortion of nature. That's corruption, right? I have an eye. An eye is a seeing organ. So sight is native to it and suitable to it. And I gash it and now it can't see. That's a privation. I have deprived it of a suitable good it's supposed to see. Negation is merely acknowledging that not every creature has every good.
Right.
So your ear doesn't have the good of sight, but that's not a privation. Because it's a hearing organ. It's not supposed to see.
Right.
So there's no distortion of nature. If your eye loses sight, that's a corruption. That's a privation.
Yes.
If your ear can't see, that's actually perfectly normal, right? There's nothing corrupt about it. And the reason I think that's important is because the presumption that says there's no death in a very blanket set, without even defining the term, there's no death, right, before the fall. And you start to apply that to plants and to animals and things like that, you're actually presuming that the good of immortality is something that every creature should have, like by right. And if it doesn't have it, that's a distortion of nature. But that's the important question. Are plants supposed to be immortal?
Right. Yeah.
And this is one of the things, Lewis talks about this in The Problem of Pain, where he's talking about specifically animal death, which we'll get to in a second. But he's like, I don't even know if to a centipede, what would immortality even mean? right? Like, is it even self-aware enough for its impending death or its immortality to be meaningful in any sort of way? And so the thing is, when I look at that, I go, well, I have no problem saying plants don't have immortality, but they're not supposed to have immortality. Right. And then that naturally raises the question of animal death.
Right.
And saying, well, are animals supposed to be immortal? Is it an evil that they die?
Yeah.
And I point out a series of patristic texts like Irenaeus, again, to appeal to Irenaeus, who is appealing to St. Paul, by the way, that he actually says the reason the body has to be transfigured in the resurrection from the dead is because animal bodies are not made to be immortal.
Right.
So he acknowledges the organic animal body, it's not naturally suited to immortality. It has to be changed in order for that to happen.
Does that open the door then for humans pre-fall being carnivorous?
Well, presumably not, because God doesn't give them permission, the animals, right? This is a sort of post-noetic, phenomenon.
Right.
If you're going to,
They're going to die anyway.
Right. This is like vegetarian. We only eat the fruit that falls and only the animals that fall.
Roadkill. That's it.
But, so I think it's fine to say that animals, died and were not eaten by man or something like that. And man didn't go about killing animals or something like that. But the idea that animals are inherently mortal, I think, is a thing that the church fathers open up. As I said, Irenaeus, there's other things. Within the Genesis account, the realm of the earth is associated with the realm of the mortal. Things come from the earth and they return to the earth, right? That's the picture of death.
Right.
And the animals come from the earth in the narrative. And it's interesting because one of the things they find in the Eastern Church Fathers is that they recognize that in the Genesis creation account, man is taken from the earth and breathed into from heaven. So not just the Eastern Church Fathers, it's the Alexandrian school in general. Philo of Alexandria recognizes the same issue. And that naturally raises a question for them. Is man mortal or is he immortal? Because when you merge the immortal things with the mortal things, what do you have?
So in the image of God, we have reason. But do we have immortality?
Right.
Built into it?
And that's the natural question that they're asking. And what's interesting is that the standard answer that emerges in Philo of Alexandria and then is echoed in very early church fathers, the Theophilus of Antioch, right? Like it's very early in Eastern patristic thought, is neither.
That's fascinating. So we don't have a bifurcation.
Yeah. What they say is that having a mortal body and an immortal soul makes him potentially mortal,
right,
or potentially immortal, with his free will functioning as the fulcrum of a balance scale to decide which nature will win out.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Now, the reason that's important, though, is because put aside man,
yes,
if we're just talking about animals, that means that they think that the animals are part of the realm of the mortal, things that are naturally mortal. They're not talking about the fall. This is all pre-fall, just the nature of things talk. John of Damascus, there's a porphyry tree where he's, organizing things according to genera, right? Things that are bodily and not bodily, right? Things that are rational, not rational, living, not living. And lo and behold, he puts animals on the side of things mortal.
Yes.
And he's not talking about post-fall. He's just talking about an organization of nature. So you have a number of these things in the church fathers that seem to presume that animals are naturally mortal. And again, like that doesn't require that that's a distortion of nature, because it goes to the question of saying, well, are they supposed to be immortal? Right? Because when we're talking about corruption, we're talking about distortions of nature.
Yes.
That's the thing God didn't create, right? So the question is, for a plant, if it's not supposed to be immortal, right? It's not naturally immortal anyway. Is it a distortion of nature that dies? Well, no more than it's a distortion of nature that your ear can't see.
Yes.
And
it would seem that animals dying, according to the church fathers, the Eastern church fathers, wouldn't actually be a distortion of nature.
Yes.
Because they are not innately immortal beings. It is not part of their nature to be immortal. And this is one of the things that C.S. Lewis goes into in The Problem of Pain, when he talks about that very thing that I talked about, where he's like, I'm not even sure, where he's exploring immortality. He's like, I'm not even sure that it would be meaningful to an animal to tell them that they're immortal, because they're not self-aware enough or sentient enough to actually embrace that as meaningful.
Now, there's another interesting thing here if we look at the Eastern Fathers, and that is that amongst the Eastern Fathers, their understanding of immortality in man is that immortality is a product of partaking of the divine nature. Okay, so this would get into, if I gave a full exposition of this, deification, things like that, it would be much too long. But suffice it to say, and people could check out my piece on resurrection, right? My episode on resurrection, if they wanted a glimpse of that. But suffice it to say that Paul says something very interesting. God alone is immortal. He actually says that to Timothy in one of his letters. And yet then he talks about us becoming immortal, putting off mortality for immortality. And how do you put those two things together? And how the Eastern Fathers put them together is what St. Peter says in his writings, which is, we escape the corruption that has come upon the world by partaking of the divine nature. In other words, when Christ offers you eternal life, he's offering you something divine.
Yes.
A portion of God's, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And this goes into the divine energies and that whole thing that I talked about, the distinction between what God is in himself and how that is expressed or articulated, and immortality being one of these. Now, the reason that's important is because for the Eastern Fathers, the only reason man is capable of immortality, of partaking of God in that way, is because we are rational spirits, right? Because we are rational beings in the image of God, we have the capacity to partake of the divine nature and attain immortality. And I'd mentioned like that the soul was immortal. That's really just sort of stated in a relative sense anyway. I've got a whole article on anthropology and the immortality of the soul in the Eastern Fathers if people want to see the more nuanced take on that, right? But the type of immortality, when we're talking about immortality that's offered to Adam and Eve,
Yes.
it's not innate to them by nature. It is something that is uniquely divine that they can only have by ongoing communion with God.
Yes.
The reason that's important is because the animals are not images of God, which means they're not capable of immortality.
Right.
Not innately. Now, there is a doctrine that I talk about. You can see my episode on Do All Dogs Go to Heaven? Where with the Eastern Fathers, they do believe that the purpose of man being a microcosm, a merger of the heavens and the earth, is so that the lower things of earth can be raised up through man.
Yes.
And so there is this sort of interesting question of whether or not immortality cascades from man to the other parts of creation. And obviously that's hinted at when you see in stories of saints, plants growing weirdly or animals behaving differently and things like that. And the question is, of course, how far does that go? Do animals actually become immortal or something like that? And the church fathers are silent on that. They don't tell us the answer to that question. But the point here is to say that the idea that somehow animals would just be innately immortal is really problematic. If immortality is uniquely divine and a being like man can only attain it through communion with the divine, and we can only commune with God in that way because we're images of God, and they are not.
Yes.
All of that points in the direction of saying the idea that animals would not be immortal doesn't seem to be problematic. It, in fact, seems to be more likely, because if you say that they're naturally immortal, but Adam's not, then you've said that there's some way ontologically superior to him.
Yes.
And so this is where I look at those sorts of things and I say all of those doctrines, and those are dogmas. That's the thing. Those are dogmas of the Eastern Fathers.
Right.
That is part of the faith handed down,
Yes.
right?
all of those point in the direction of saying it's possible that animals lacking immortality is a negation, not a privation. It's not a distortion of nature. And so when I look at that, I go, I don't see any problem with the idea that plants died, prior to the fall of man.
Right.
I don't see a problem with animals being mortal and dying prior to the fall of creation. Now, of course, people get weirded out about disease and animal predation, animals eating each other.
Right.
And they're like, well, is that natural? And I'm kind of agnostic about that. I'm like, once you have a mortal ecosystem, I don't know that carnivorous behavior is problematic. But let's just pretend that it is. There is a doctrine that would account for it. And that's the doctrine of the fall of angels.
Right.
So angels are identified in Scripture as ministering spirits. And when you look at the Eastern Fathers and you trace what the Church Fathers say about that sort of thing, what you find is that means they minister to planets, they are caretakers of the elements, they are caretakers of individual humans, of nations, and yes, even of the animals.
Yes.
And so once you introduce that, and then you introduce the fall of angels, and this is another important point that I'll come back to in a second, but you introduce the fall of angels, which takes place before the fall of man. You open the door to the possibility that the animals were corrupted by the fallen angels prior to the fall of man.
May have been something stirring in Eden, even prior to him showing up.
Well, let me say something on that. First of all, in terms of Eden, again, this goes to the more allegorical reading. The Eastern Fathers don't see Eden primarily as a place.
Right.
So again, this is part of the very direct, literal, naive sort of way of reading Genesis, where it's a garden, that is a physical location, and it's the beauty and delight of the garden that makes it paradise.
Right.
Basil of Caesarea says explicitly, Adam was immediately out of paradise when he sinned. Why? Because the paradise of God, the paradise of Eden was the divine vision, the communion with God.
Right.
The moment you broke that, your feet are in the same location, but you are out of paradise.
I see. Yeah, fascinating.
And so that's again, like, I think there's a tendency to say, like, there's this pocket in the world that, was idyllic in a physical sense, similar to like the geocentric thing, right? Like the earth is the center of the cosmos spatially, as opposed to saying theologically. And I think in the Eastern Fathers, you definitely find this impulse towards saying Eden is primarily the fact that they had divine vision. They had communion with God in a way that made their existence paradise wherever they went. Didn't matter where they went.
Now,
so I would just,
Everybody can identify with that, I think.
so I would say that, but I would also just say that, then the idea that maybe there was some sort of corruption that was, if it could be demonstrated. And I'm not convinced, right? I'm not convinced that animals who are innately mortal, experiencing disease or, engaging in carnivorous behavior, that's inherently a sign of evil, right? I think that's entirely possible that a mortal ecosystem could have those sorts of dynamics. But even if we could demonstrate that those are a corruption of nature, I think, their demonology could account for it. And incidentally, C.S. Lewis toys with these sorts of things all over the place. If you read Paralandra, right, or Out of the Silent Planet, you read the Space Trilogy, you'll find that he talks about our planet being the silent planet because our Eldil, right, or our Yorsa, the archangel that oversees the planet rebelled. And then in rebelling, he actually made war with other parts of the cosmos. He made certain species extinct, right? Like Lewis, and then he's eventually banished to this planet to limit his corrupting influence and so on. Lewis is clearly toying with those sorts of ideas. Yeah. He also flirts with the idea in his chapter on animal immortality or mortality, the same sort of point that hypothetically they could be corrupted by the demons and so on. Yeah. But that gets to another really, really important point. The Church Fathers are all clear that the angels fall before man. And one of those shows up in the Genesis narrative.
Yes.
Which means, and this is an important thing to get, unless you're thinking about the world like we have a clockwork and spiritual stuff is not part of our world, which is not how the Church Fathers think. The devil and the angels are part of our world. They are part of the cosmic system.
Yes.
And it's clear that that fourth type of corruption I mentioned, becoming wicked, happens before man falls. So death was already, that form of death, spiritual corruption, was already in the cosmos before man sinned.
Yes.
Because one of those corrupt beings shows up in Eden and is important to the narrative.
Yes.
Right? And so the entire idea that somehow, no, before man falls, there's no forms of death, I think is just theologically problematic. And that's where my point in pointing all of that stuff out wasn't to say, and that's why you'll find that all the church fathers think the world is, the cosmos is 13.8 billion years old. Like, no, I actually acknowledge, like, a lot of them think it's pretty young.
Yes.
But when I had said that if you're going to be a young earth person who is orthodox, right, who affirms the Eastern Church Fathers, you better not carry this bad theology into it. The bad theology that says animals are innately immortal, plants are innately immortal, man was innately immortal. That there was no forms of corruption, including the fall of the angels before man sinned.
Oh, I see where you're going now. Full circle on that. Yeah.
Right. That's all bad theology.
Yeah.
And so you could still go ahead and say, I'm going to go with a young earth position.
Right.
But you better correct all of that theology because it's really bad theology, right? That needs to be rejected.
It creates unnecessary wobbles in the theological system if you're bringing all that in with it.
Yeah. And so however you read St. Paul on death entering the world, it better not sort of move contrary to these sorts of things. I don't know how to read them other than talking about, death coming to all of man. And in this sense, man becoming corrupted tears down the bridge of the hope of the rest of nature to commune with God through man, right? There is a cascading effect that happens there.
Yes.
But he surely can't mean that's the first time any creature rebelled. The angels had already rebelled.
Yes.
And he surely can't mean that's the first time organic bodies started breaking down, right? The plants are allowed to, they're given permission to eat them.
Well, that gives us all sorts of cognitive space, if you will, to coherently think about pre-fall and post-fall. Realization that plants and humans have different capacities or potentialities, and what's natural to one may or may not, or is it partially natural to one, and one might be open to immortality in a different sort of way. That's all fascinating stuff. My mind immediately goes, and I'm going to resist taking us there, but to the implication of what is justice and what does the end look like because of these things?
Yeah.
Does that open to annihilation? Does that open to various other aspects of thinking about those things? We're going to resist that one.
Well, let me give a 2-minute just sort of teaser on that.
Okay.
Which is to say, I do think there's an important East-West difference. I think a lot of people in the West tend to think of Eden as the ideal that we're trying to get back to.
Right.
Right? In the Eastern Fathers, that's not true.
Right.
In the Eastern Fathers, man is made in God's image with the intent of him bearing his likeness, but the likeness is something that has to be actively appropriated. And so when man sins, he never becomes what he's made to be.
Yes.
Adam is not your ideal. Christ is. That's the first time the making of man is complete with the resurrected Christ. Now we see what man is supposed to be. And so the reason I think that's important is because rather than saying, well, Eden is the picture of what the Eschaton is supposed to be, and we're just circling around, we've just taken a detour to get back there. For the Eastern Fathers, the end transcends the beginning.
Right.
Right? Like what things become. Man in Eden is not complete.
Yes.
He's not yet what he is made to be. So man in the Eschaton is superior to Adam.
Yeah.
Right? And so in the same way, I'm inclined to think, and so it would be for the rest of nature. If nature has hope of communing with God, the end should transcend the beginning, as opposed to just being a full circle return to it, as if this was just a bad detour just to get back to where we started.
Yeah, well, that does seem like it has some affinities with Lewis as well, the Middle Earth concept that this is not at all the culmination of creation, that there's this new creation that we're awaiting, this eighth day, that unfolding. That's fascinating stuff. So, wow. Yeah. Well, what else?
Evolution.
Yeah, well, that's where I would like to go
We've
back.
Teased it.
We've teased it. How do we land that ship now with regards to, Darwin and the claim of science that evolution is a self-organizing through this quest for survival, and is that something that we can entertain in any sense?
Yeah,
as Christians.
Well, I'll give you so I gave a spoiler. I'm not an evolutionist. And I'll give you my reasons for rejecting evolution. And those reasons are first philosophical, but by extension, I do think they apply to the Eastern Church Fathers. And this is what I mean. The argument I would give against evolution is primarily due to realism. It's my realist commitments that make me opposed to evolution, which are philosophical. But of course, I do believe the Eastern Fathers are dogmatically realist, that is part of the faith given over to the saints. So if I'm correct that evolution is at odds with realism, then there is something in the Eastern Church Fathers that would oppose evolution. Might not oppose that animals died. It might not oppose that plants died. It might not oppose that the world could be, and by world I'm using the entire cosmos, could be exceedingly old. But evolution as a theory where you have, one species giving rise to other species, I think that's actually the thing that's problematic, and you run into something that's problematic. So here's my criticism of evolution, and this is the sort of thing, as I said, you could read in the theological letters. But with evolution, just if I'm going to frame what the theory is, right? And I'll frame it using the distinction between essential and accidental properties. So for people who are unfamiliar with this distinction, standard sort of logical and Aristotelian distinction, when we talk about a square, right, that it has four sides, that's essential to it. You don't have a square without that. That it's got right angles, right? That's essential to a square. That is blue, that is 2 feet wide, right? Like those are all accidental.
Right.
Can still be a square and be not 2 feet wide, right? It can not be blue and you still have a square, right? So that's the distinction between essential and accidental properties. And essentially the theory of evolution, if I'm going to frame it in those terms, is that compounding accidental properties eventually give rise to a change in essential properties.
Yes.
But by definition, accidental properties have no bearing on the essential properties.
Yes.
That's what makes them accidental, that they're subject to change without affecting the essential properties of the thing. So immediately on the surface, I'm suspicious of the theory once I look at it in that light.
Right.
Now, the other thing that I think is problematic is that when I sort of flesh out evolution, I run into what I think is a sleight of hand with the theory. So I'm going to weave a little bit of a tale, pun intended, here about
That's pretty good.
about the theory of evolution. So let's talk about this being, the hominidib, right? This one particular type of entity, and hominidibs are tailless. And one day there is a hominidib who's born with some sort of mutation, a growth on its backside, right? And then that one ends up continuing to procreate, and its progeny start to also have this growth. And in later generations, as things move along, that growth gets larger and larger, more pronounced. And eventually it gets so pronounced in certain later generations that it becomes advantageous to balance and other aspects of survival. And so what happens is over time, the ones that don't have this growth end up dying off. But the ones who have this growth end up surviving. And lo and behold, now we have tailed hominidibs because natural selection, right? That's a sort of common, very simplistic evolutionary tale, right, that we might offer. Again, pun intended.
Yes.
Now, here's the problem that I have with it. As a realist, a tail is something, right? There is a difference between a growth and a tail. And within this narrative, I performed a little magic trick where I got you to forget we were talking about a growth. And before you knew it, we were talking about a tail.
Yes.
And I slid that in there at some point, right? Now, the problem is, as much as the imagination is providing a gradation, a smooth transition, at some point there's a leap. We had a species that's tailless, and now it's tailed. And that is binary. That is a leap that's going to take place. Now, the problem, of course, is that macroevolution, there was a theory of punctuated evolution, chicken lays an egg and the lizard comes out, right? But that fell out of favor in favor of what we have now as terms of the gradual macroevolutionary processes. And so the problem I have is that gradual process has to slip in. It only functionally, it has to at some point introduce a macro jump.
Yes.
Right. And it's sort of hiding that with the sleight of hand of the story of transitional stages. Now, I think there's a couple of issues here that immediately I could anticipate as a response, right? One of those is that this is a line drawing fallacy, right? Well, you're saying there's no difference between a beard and the stages before it's a beard, right? When does a beard become a beard? And if you can't tell me there's no such thing as a beard, right? Something like that.
Right.
But of course, from a realist perspective, the realist can account for that with the category of potential, right? That you are potentially bearded, right? And as that moves into being, there are gradations of that until you have a beard.
Yes.
Right? And so in this sense, what you're talking about is the gradations are a byproduct of the reality of it, the fact that you are bearded in potential, right?
Right.
Well, if in the narrative we're going to say that hominidibs are actually tailed by nature, but only in potential, and over time this is generationally developing, as opposed to developing over the course of the lifetime of just one of them, well, then we have a very different story, right? But that's not the story that evolution is telling.
Right.
So we could account for the gradation by an appeal to a potential actual distinction, but that's not possible, given the nature of the narrative.
Yes.
So the alternative is nominalism. And the nominalist stance is probably the stance that most evolutionists would take, which is to say, well, look, nub, tail, these are just names that we apply. There's not really a difference, right? We're just talking about lumps of cell, and some are bigger and some are smaller, and we just sort of just sit here and we brand one this and we brand the other that and so on. Yep, you could do that and try to make the problem go away. Get rid of realism, and now you've gotten rid of the problem. But here's the problem that I have with that. I mean, obviously I am a committed realist, and I'm a committed realist because I think all of logic and language and perception and everything else requires realism. But here's the problem for science. Scientific induction becomes fallacious without realism. So I'll give you an example of scientific induction in defense of evolution, right? So there's a thing called a telomere, right, which is the sort of terminus of a DNA strand. And one of the cases for evolution is to say, look, a telomere is the terminus of a DNA strand. We have examples of fused telomere, a DNA strand that has two telomere, at some point in it that are fused, which indicates at one point these were two different, DNA strands that came together, right? Okay, fascinating observation. But here's the problem. Everything about that functions on realist principles. What I've identified is a species of thing, telomere. I've identified its final cause to serve as the terminus of a DNA strand. And from that, I'm able to infer inductively the anomaly, right? Now, the thing is, let's do a little bit of basic logic, right? Square of opposition, right? This tool in logic where you examine the relationship between different types of claims. All P is Q, no P is Q, some P is Q, some P is not Q. One of the things that's really clear about that is you can't move from a some claim to an all claim, right? That would be logically fallacious. I can't say this car is blue, therefore all cars are blue. Can't do that. Now, I can go from an all claim to a some claim. All cars are blue. This is car, therefore this is blue. That would be valid, right? That would work. And the thing is, though, scientific induction works if I'm a realist who can say, when I talk about telomere, I'm talking about all telomere are this. I'm making a universal claim because I'm dealing in universals. But if I'm a nominalist, and there is no connection between this thing I call a telomere and that thing I call a telomere because there are no universals, then every scientific observation is an I claim. Some bits of things that look like this are this way, right? And I can't make any universal inferences from that. And so to sit there and say, yeah, sometimes this thing is at the end of a DNA strand and sometimes it's in the middle, as a nominalist, I would just have to accept that, or I'd move into a fallacious form of reasoning because I'm just dealing in a series of individuated, instances. Some claims. Only if I'm a realist can I say the nature of a telomere is to be the terminus of a DNA strand. And so when I find it not at the terminus, that's an anomaly.
Yes.
Right? In other words, what I think the problem is that scientific induction, in order to avoid being fallacious, has to be realist.
Yes.
And so if the only way of defending evolution is to jettison realism, I think with it you jettison all the evidence you have for evolution.
Yes.
In other words, I think it falls into incoherence. To make the theory function, I have to get rid of realism, but the only reason to believe the theory is realism, realist inductions.
Yes.
And so that's my problem with it. And that's one of the reasons why I'm inclined to think it just doesn't work. Now, I'll also say this, as I said, this cascades into the church fathers. So are the church fathers realists? Yes. Are they happenstance, non-substantive realists, like, the way they have some of them have a certain view of optics? No. It's woven into the Arian dispute when they talk about the nature of God and the nature of creatures and common natures and the natures of Christ. That's all committed forms of realism. So the Eastern Fathers are realists. And so if I'm correct that realism is incompatible with evolution, then there is something in the Church Fathers that's incompatible with evolution, namely their realism. And this is the sort of thing some people did raise these sorts of things, when they were objecting to me under the presumption I was an evolutionist, which is ironic because they're raising things that I'm saying right now, which is, they'll point out, well, in Genesis, it says each one is made according to its kind, right? Meaning its form or its essence or its nature, right? So Genesis presumes that things have certain stable natures. I agree, right? And that's a realist claim. Right. Or they talk about the logoi doctrine, which has a similar sort of thing. That's a specifically Eastern patristic thing related to creation, that each thing has a logoi or a divine word that brings it about, which has a similar sort of realist connotations. I agree. Right. And so when I look at that, I sit there and I say, I do think there's an incompatibility between realism and evolution. And that's actually why I reject evolution. And I do think the Eastern Fathers are committed to realism. So I think that part of their theology is at odds with evolution. I actually do think that.
Yes. Well, that will hopefully take down a few barriers, a few concerns for some folks.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to make this claim in more detail. You already have on your Substack and so forth. Will you go to step 3?
What's step 3?
Well, what is actually the case in terms of the age of the earth and the issues surrounding, I don't know where all this goes. I mean, are you interested in wading into these contemporary debates between the young and old earthers, or the evolutionists or creationists, or
Lord have mercy. I mean, look, I'm not interested in.
If you're not an evolutionist, are you a creationist?
Well, yeah. So if we're defining creationists as I believe there is a God, and I believe that he is the author of the cosmos,
yes,
and I believe that this is all organized according to his designs, of course I am. And this is one of the things where I'm like, are the church fathers creationists? Of course they are. This is the thing that I mentioned with Basil of Caesarea, where he says how God does it, we leave to those on the outside, but that God does it is the thing that we're insistent upon.
Yeah.
And I think that captures it quite perfectly. Now, as you might expect, I'm somewhat circumspect on a lot of these things because I don't think they require dogmatic commitment.
The thatness is orthodoxy. The howness is not.
Right. That's right.
Okay.
Now, does that mean that all hows are equally viable? Like, no. So this is where I pointed out, well, a certain form of evolutionism,
right,
I think is incompatible with both sound reason, realism, and the church fathers. And so that how is problematic. Right. And so I do have objections to that on philosophical grounds and on theological grounds. But does that mean that I now have an alternative how to give you?
Right.
And the answer is no, I don't. Right. And so in certain things where I see no theological issues, like the cosmos being 13.8 billion years, I'm inclined to just shrug and say, I don't know if all of this science is irrefutable on that, but, since that seems to be the current scientific consensus, I tend to default to it because I don't see anything theologically problematic about it. And what little I know about the science behind it seems to be reasonable, right? And so I tend in that direction. On the other aspects of things, I immediately see a philosophical problem, which then also is a theological problem. And for that reason, I have a tendency to say, like, well, no, this particular how, the evolution, macroevolution, I have a problem with. And that's where I'm sympathetic then to other scientists who want to say, well, the Cambrian explosion creates a problem for this or whatever it might be, right? Certain mathematical objections to it, which again are not my area, but I listen to them. And because they align with where I've landed philosophically with the problems with the theory, I'm inclined to, my priors are to say, well, no, I'm inclined to think that these objections probably do have some validity to them.
Yeah.
Now I will say that, and I've said this before, I say this in my Substack, right? Is there a form of evolution that I could accept? And there's a kind of that I offered to it, right? And this is where the kind of that I said was basically the idea that the cosmos is a giant organism, right? That basically over time expands and goes through cell division, and out of that cell division, certain things emerge out of other certain things, right? Until finally you have a fully formed, fully realized cosmos. And this would be similar to you or to me, right? So within a realist perspective, when you're talking about an embryo, a fertile like this embryo, you already have a human person in potential, right? Like as in the nature is already present. And the reason matter is going to cell divide and grow and develop into this is because the nature is driving it forward. The coding is already there, so to speak. And so that's why matter starts to organize in the way that it does. And so I have no objection looking at the cosmos and saying the cosmos writ large is one creature. So you do find these sort of interesting statements, right? Athanasius talking about the cosmos being like one creature. Right. God makes one thing. Now, he's not denying that God, that there are differences between cats and dogs, just like there's a difference between your heart and your lungs, but that the cosmos is one giant created system, right? Yeah. Like one thing in a certain sense is true. That's why I'd said, for example, the angels are part of that system. You can't sort of bracket them on the outside or something like that. They're part of that system. And so when you look at that, I think you do find statements in the church fathers that would advocate that way of looking at the cosmos, that it's like one giant creature. You do see in Gregory of Nyssa, for example, when he describes the development of things, he's thinking in that porphyry tree of certain things developing out of others and sharing things with others and so on. Now, the thing is, I think a lot of people will immediately have an aversion where they're like, well, wait a second. How can you say that each one is made according to its kind if they were originally sort of like primordially unified and then started splitting into all of this sort of stuff? Well, the same way I do it with you, right? Like you implicitly had lungs and a heart and a liver and a soul, like all these, you implicitly have all of those different things, right? And it's the coding that drives matter forward to develop into all of those different components that move from potential to actual, articulating the coding that's already there. So in the coding, there's a difference between your heart and your lungs. But that's an implicit thing because those things have not yet developed into concrete reality. And so as matter develops and it maps and it makes concretely real the coding that's within it, you get the division between lungs and heart and brain and so on.
Yeah.
And so could I accept that the cosmos itself has sort of a primordial embryonic sort of state that explodes and develops over time? Now, all of the coding of all the different species of things are already in it.
Yes.
And it moves through this sort of developmental process, just like you and I moved through a development process. I could absolutely accept that. And in fact, I could accept that as something that has to be almost dogmatically true about creatures. And the reason is because within the Aryan dispute, which I mentioned, when they're talking about the nature of creatures, one of the baseline, dogmas of the Eastern Fathers is that what a creature is something that moves from potential to actual.
Right.
Something that was a possibility that became a concrete reality, and that is a movement and a change that involves mutation, right? Like they describe that. Now, does that mean that movement had to be really slow? No, right? It could be really fast, but that is part of the nature of creatureliness is true. Yeah. Now, here's the problem. The reason I said sort of with regard to evolution is because that's not evolution, right? From the outside, it might look kind of like evolution because you have this sort of primordial developments, and out of that primordial development, all these different species unfolding and things like that. Yeah. So it might look like evolution. But if evolution is the view that one species of thing turns into another species of thing, and the mechanism for that is random mutation aimed at survival or something like that, that's a very different claim. Right. Than saying the coding for the thing is already in there and it's just moving from potential to actual. And so the potential to actual picture that says, look, the cosmos is a giant organism that's already, all of this is coded in it, and we're just watching the unfolding, and it might unfold over 13.8 billion years, that I can accept. But what I can't accept is the random mutation aimed at survival that where one species turns into another species over time or something like that. That's something that I would reject. So that's where I'd said, like, well, that other thing, I guess I could accept as a form of evolution. I'm just not sure it's a form of evolution, right?
Wow, that's pretty good. I mean, I think we're all going to be looking forward to the next release.
I'm not sure all of us.
Well, I like how you've come back to that as a possibility. Again, we're just talking about possibilities here, and that it might be an original potentiality, a seed. Mm-hmm. Right. That grew into a tree. No.
You really love this tree metaphor, I'll tell you what.
That has unfolded here and it's still unfolding. And I think that's very, very helpful to loosen up the grip of this bifurcation that seems to be getting all this airtime. Yeah. You have two interestingly similar mentalities, as it were, for different reasons. One coming from science, one coming from a very strict interpretation of scripture and so forth. But what I'm hearing from you is a far more nuanced, far more open to conversation view about how these things are to be understood over time, integrated, and in our quest to seek the truth.
Right.
And that's one of our highest orders as being truly human, is that we want to know, the way things actually are. How is reality speaking to us? And I think that's what's so good about the work that you do is your ability to help us with the categories to begin to parse that out.
Right.
And I think we've seen a lot of that here in this conversation. So thank you for that. And is there any last words that you want to have? Because we probably long form here.
No, I think we've gone quite long. I think you summarize it quite well. So yeah, I mean, inevitably with a topic like this, my mind is racing through all sorts of different things that I'd love to love to throw out there.
And
But
Lord willing, we'll be able to hear those from you in the years to come, because the great conversation's ongoing. We didn't know we were stepping right into it in our last one.
no.
But we did.
Yeah.
And my hunch is we probably stepped into something here again.
My hunch is we've stepped into it.
Well, thank you again for your time and for putting up with my questions and helping me clarify some things that I'm going to be doing a lot of thinking about in the days to come.
Yeah.
So really appreciate that. Well, that's it for the Firestone Files for now, and the
Nathan Jacobs Podcast.
And thank you guys for listening, and do chime in. We'd love to hear from you, because that obviously that impacts what we talk about in the days ahead. And certainly would love to hear more from Dr. Jacobs. That's it for now. Take care.
All right. So there you have it. That's my interview with Chris Firestone. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.
The Christian East and the Christian West share the same creed, the same scriptures, and yet they are worlds apart. The differences run deeper than Mary or icons or liturgy, going to the very nature of God, the hope of salvation, and even what it means to be human. They use the same words, but their meanings could not be more different. As these two worlds collide in our contemporary culture, what's needed is a translator. I spent nearly 2 decades studying these two traditions, devoting myself to figures like Augustine, Aquinas, and the Reformers in the West, but finding myself crossing the threshold of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And now, I'm producing a 25-part lecture series to help bridge this gap, exploring the differences between Eastern and Western Christianity. Pre-order the series now at the lowest price that will ever be offered, or support my efforts by becoming a series producer at theeastwestseries.com. That's theeastwestseries.com.